In 1935, Curtiss Wright built one of the first of a new breed of sleek, all-metal American fighter aircraft. Though it had a pretty disastrous beginning and an uneventful service life with US pilots, it would go on to serve extensively overseas with a variety of countries in the lead up to and during the Second World War. We are, of course, talking about the Curtiss P-36 Hawk. In the early 1930s, the Army Air Corps had been forced to accept that the era of the biplane was drawing to a close. Despite being hobbled by the financial effects of the Great Depression, development had progressed on a new generation of bomber aircraft, the best examples being the Boeing B-9 and the Martin B-10. This put the Army in the rather embarrassing position of having bombers that were faster than their best pursuit aircraft. And while the Boeing P-26 sort of corrected this, its design was already considered outdated after only a couple of years of service. And so, in the spring of 1935, the Army opened a competition for the development of a modern pursuit fighter. The aircraft submitted by Curtiss was the Model 75. This was a departure from previous models, as the principal designer was Donovan Berlin, who had previously worked for Northrop. The Model 75 was a low-wing monoplane of all-metal construction, with the exception of the control surfaces which were still fabric-clad. It was to have a fully enclosed cockpit with a sliding canopy, a fully retractable undercarriage with the main wheels slotting into the wings, and construction of the prototype began in 1934. At this time, it was a completely private venture by Curtiss, though they were expecting the Army Air Corps to announce a design competition at some point in the near future. As it turned out, their metaphorical crystal ball was almost accurate to the day, and the prototype took off in May 1935, the same month as the announcement of the competition. The prototype performed well during the initial tests, with the sole exception that its maximum speed was slower than expected. Its engine was an experimental 2-row 14-cylinder version of the Wright Whirlwind, dubbed the XR1670-6, and it would become a source of frequent mechanical headaches. Nevertheless, Curtiss were generally satisfied with their prototype, as was the Army, and it was sent to Wright Field to take part in the competitive trials. These trials took some time to get underway, owing to the lack of competing aircraft, and it turned out that the prototype submitted by Curtiss was the only one to actually arrive on time. The prototype developed by Seversky, considered the main rival for Curtiss, had been heavily damaged during a delivery incident and had to be returned for repairs, during which it was changed from a two-seater fixed landing gear fighter into a more competitive single-seat model with a retractable undercarriage. This would become the basis of the Seversky P-35. The only other major competitor was the almost completely unknown Northrop 2A, which remained unknown as during its maiden flight on July 30th, it took off, headed out over the Pacific Ocean, and promptly disappeared. The pursuit fighter competition was delayed to allow Seversky to rebuild their prototype. This prompted Curtiss to protest, claiming that Seversky were now being given an unfair advantage as they were now actively modifying their prototype rather than just repairing it. As a result, the competition was then further delayed until 1936, so that Curtiss could then make their own modifications. The experimental Wright engine was replaced with a 700 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1535. However, concerns were soon raised about a potential lack of power, and the engine was changed again to a 950 horsepower 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone. During this delay, the opportunity was also taken to strengthen the canopy and adjust the fuselage behind the cockpit to improve rear visibility. Unfortunately, the new engine proved to be as cantankerous as the old one. No less than 4 engine changes were made during the trials at Wright Field, and the aircraft's top speed was still slower than expected. As a result of this, the Seversky prototype would win the competition, earning a contract ordering 77 models under the new designation of P-35. For Curtiss, the disappointment was actually short-lived. The Army Air Corps had reservations about Seversky's capacity to meet delivery requirements, and combined with the growing saber-rattling in Europe, they decided a backup aircraft was needed. And so on the 16th of June 1936, Curtiss received an order for 3 service test models of the 75B that were redesignated as the Y1P-36. The first of these was delivered to the Army in March of 1937. The main difference between the prototype and the test model were the change to the 900 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engine and further modifications to the rear cockpit to again further improve rear visibility. The Y1P-36 was a significant improvement over the original prototype, and it so thoroughly impressed the Army that it won a new pursuit fighter competition in 1937, and orders were placed for 210 production aircraft as the P-36A. This was the largest single order for military aircraft in the US since the First World War, but it would not be the only order Curtiss would receive. Indeed, most of the P-36 fighters produced would be the various export models. However, I'll cover the domestic versions first to keep things simple. The first production model, the P-36A, arrived at Wright Field in April of 1938. The 20th Pursuit Group, based at Barksdale Field in Louisiana, had been the intended first recipient of the new fighter, and expecting this, they had chosen to relinquish their old P-26s ahead of time. Unfortunately, upon arriving, the P-36s almost immediately encountered an extensive array of teething problems. Severe buckling of the metal skin was observed near the landing gear wells, which required adding reinforcements and thickening the skin. Engine exhaust difficulties threatened to either A, rob the aircraft of power, or B, threaten self-immolation, and despite fixes on the production line and in the field, numerous P-36s were repeatedly grounded. This was the cause for some embarrassment for both Curtiss and the 20th Pursuit Group, as at one point they were left with just 6 operational fighters between 3 squadrons, with many pilots lamenting the loss of their old P-shooters. Some of these problems took a considerable amount of time to fix, and by that time the P-36A was being relegated to the training role in the US. Development was considerably underway on the newer, more powerful P-40, which had taken the painful lessons of the P-36 to heart, and the only combat experienced by US P-36s was during the attack on Pearl Harbor, during which 5 were able to get into the air and shoot down a pair of Japanese Zeros. Attempts had been made to improve the P-36 in the US, but they didn't have much of an impact overall. A single P-36B was produced in 1938. It was fitted with a 1,100 horsepower supercharged twin Wasp to evaluate the engine's supercharged gearing, but it was eventually converted back to a P-36A at the conclusion of the tests. The last 30 models of the original order for 210 aircraft were converted to the P-36C. These had a 1,200 horsepower twin Wasp engine and an additional pair of 30 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. Experiments were also made with a complete change of power plant. The XP-37 and the 13 subsequent test models were powered by the Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine. The experimental prototype first flew in June of 1937, and the Army was very impressed by its performance. Unfortunately, it was a short-lived project. Problems around the supercharger led to multiple delays, and the high cost of each completed aircraft sealed its fate. So yes, overall the P-36 didn't have a very exciting life with the US Armed Forces, but it did significantly better overseas. A large number were exported to various countries around the world, and during World War II, many captured aircraft were brought into service with other powers. This led to one of the few occasions during the conflict in which American-built planes fought against other American-built planes. Early in 1937, Curtiss began development work on a simplified version of the Y1P-36 to be sold for export. Not all overseas customers enjoyed climates or budgets that were kind towards complicated aircraft, and sophisticated features like a retractable landing gear threatened all kinds of maintenance problems, and so the Model 75H was developed. In general, its construction was similar to that of the Y1P-36, but it had a fixed landing gear and a lower-powered engine of 875 horsepower. Emphasis was placed on ease of maintenance, rough field performance, and the aircraft's capacity to accommodate different types of engines and armament. The first overseas customer for this aircraft was China, who placed an initial order for 112 units at the end of 1937. These aircraft were retroactively designated as the Hawk 75M by Curtiss. It is unclear how many of these actually ended up in Chinese service, as only 30 Hawk 75Ms are accounted for in Curtiss records, with deliveries beginning in May of 1938. Tooling equipment and kits for an unspecified number of additional aircraft were also delivered, but there seems to be no record of any more aircraft actually being assembled. In total, 3 full squadrons of Hawks are known to have been operated, but they achieved little success against the Japanese forces, largely due to poor serviceability and the inadequate training of pilots and ground crews. The simplified version of the Hawk was also exported to a few other countries under different designations. Thailand operated the Hawk 75N, and Argentina operated the Hawk 75O. Argentina also required a license to manufacture the 75O domestically, with 20 units being built at a supposedly better standard than the export models that were delivered to them. Along with the simplified Hawk, Curtiss also exported production versions of the P-36A, with most of them going to European nations. The French Air Force would be the largest foreign operator of the P-36, and it was one of their most fielded aircraft at the time of the German invasion in 1940. French interest in the P-36 dated back to 1938, when the government entered into negotiations with Curtiss to supply them with 300 export models. The Hawk 75A was an export model of the P-36A, and could be sold with either the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp or the Wright Cyclone engine. Unfortunately, these negotiations were fraught with difficulty. The unit price asked by Curtiss was high enough to be considered insulting, and the Army Air Corps opposed the deal as they doubted Curtiss could meet both their own delivery requirements and those of the French. However, with Hitler eyeing off bits of Europe with the hunger of a bear in spring, the French need for military equipment was growing by the day. This was further compounded by development issues encountered in France with their own aircraft. And so, in mid-1938, an initial contract was signed for 100 units of the Hawk 75A1. This was partly made possible due to the personal intervention of President Roosevelt, who allowed the French test pilot a chance to fly the Y-1 P-36 and report his findings back to the French government. Between 1938 and the armistice between France and Germany, multiple orders were placed for the Hawk, and the design of the export model would be changed several times. In France, the name of Hawk was never used, and the aircraft were known simply as the H-75. Not counting for units lost in delivery, and those never assembled for combat, the strength of the French Hawks totaled 291 aircraft. They saw action within the first month of the war in Europe, with units from the Groupe de Chasse 2-4 shooting down a pair of Bf-109Es in September of 1939, claiming the first Allied aerial victories of the conflict. Generally, they were outclassed by the Bf-109, being neither as fast or as well armed, but their superior maneuverability and ability to take more punishment helped to even things out. During the fighting through 1939 and 1940, French pilots claimed 230 air-to-air kills and 81 probable against a loss of just 29 H-75s. Though potentially optimistic, it would mean that just over 1/3 of all French kills during the Battle of France were made by an aircraft that made up less than 1/6 of its single-seat fighter force. After the collapse of French resistance, the aircraft that had not escaped across the Channel were captured by the Luftwaffe. In fact, some of them had not even been assembled and were still in their delivery crates. These aircraft were taken back to Germany, where they were overhauled and refitted with German instrumentation before being sent to Finland. In total, the Finnish Air Force would receive 44 captured aircraft between 1941 and 1944. Most were French models, but 13 also came from Norway after the German invasion. The aircraft were well liked by Finnish pilots, who nicknamed it Susu, or Sweetheart, and they scored a truly remarkable ratio of 190 kills for the loss of just 15. Some of the Hawks would remain in France to be operated by the Vichy Air Force. In 1942, during the landings of Operation Torch, elements of these units would engage carrier-launched Grumman F-4F Wildcats. It was one of the few occasions of the war where American-built aircraft would engage other American-built aircraft. The battle was rather one-sided, though, with the Hawks being considerably outclassed by their carrier-based opponents, and the battle ended with the loss of 15 planes against 7. After France, England would become the second biggest operator of the Hawks, but only as a result of the additional influx of French models in 1940. Based on several favourable trials, the British government briefly entertained the idea of ordering the Hawk for RAF service, but the order for units was never placed. In some respects, the Hawk turned out to be superior to the Mark I version of the Spitfire, a statement that is no doubt heresy in some aviation circles I know, but it's true. The RAE observed that in a diving attack at 400 miles an hour, the Hawk was superior to the Spitfire thanks to its lighter and well-harmonized controls. In dogfight conditions at 250 miles an hour, again, the Hawk wiped the Spitfire's eye by being more maneuverable and easier to control. Mostly because its elevators, unlike the Spitfires, weren't overly sensitive to the point of being a threat to the pilot's safety. However, the Spitfire won out thanks to its raw power and acceleration, which allowed its pilots to engage and break from combat at will, something the Hawk could not achieve. In RAF service, the impressed Hawk 75s from France would be renamed the Mohawk. In total, the RAF would find itself in possession of 229 planes, mostly French, but some also came from the Middle East and India. They were redesignated into 4 subvariants as the Mohawk Marks 1 through to 4. Early on, it was decided that they were not suitable for the European theatre, though a bit of wounded pride from the aforementioned tests may have influenced this decision, and the Mohawks were sent to South Africa and India. 5 squadrons of Mohawks were operated by South Africa, and 2 were operated by India. At one point, just 8 Mohawks provided the only fighter defense for all of northeast India, being kept mechanically operational by sheer willpower. And the fighter remained operational on the Burma front until finally being replaced by more modern fighters, including its successor, the P-40, in December of 1943. In total, the P-36 would be operated by no less than 14 different countries, mostly as an export, but sometimes as captured equipment. Records have them being operated by Argentina, Brazil, Britain, China, Finland, France, India, Iran, the Dutch East Indies, Norway, Peru, Portugal, South Africa, and Thailand. For an aircraft that started off with an appalling history of mechanical problems, the P-36 well and truly redeemed itself overseas, and a few models even managed to survive the war. Several surviving examples can be found around the world, including 2 airworthy models that are part of the fighter collection in Duxford. For Curtiss, the P-36 was a commercial success, with over 1,100 domestic and export models being built. But more importantly, its development, and the hard lessons learned from it, set a foundation for Curtiss to develop one of the most important fighter aircraft of World War II, the P-40 Warhawk. But that's a video for another day. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.